One journalist decided a killer needed a better story, so he wrote one. And by the time the ink dried, a farm boy from Missouri with blood on his hands had become America's most beloved outlaw. This is how a myth becomes more dangerous than the man. Missouri, 1866. The war was over, technically. For the men who had ridden with Quantrill's raiders, who had burned Lawrence, Kansas to the ground, who had lived for 4 years by the rule that the fastest gun determined who went home, the peace was an insult. They came back to find their land seized, their neighbors hostile, and a government that called them traitors and meant it. Jesse Woodson James was 17 when the war ended. He had ridden with Bloody Bill Anderson. He had participated in a massacre at Centralia that left 150 unarmed Union soldiers dead in a field. He had done things that a ceasefire could not undo. He was not ready for a quiet life. He may never have been capable of one. In February of 1866, a group of former Confederate guerrillas walked into a bank in Liberty, Missouri in broad daylight, emptied the vault, and rode out at a gallop. A student standing on the street was shot dead. The James boys, Jesse and his older brother Frank, were among them. Nobody could prove it yet. It was the first daylight bank robbery in American history in peacetime. They had invented something. For the next 15 years, the James Younger gang terrorized the post-war Midwest in the way that men do when they have no other skill and no other identity. Banks, trains, stagecoaches, Kansas, Iowa, Kentucky, Minnesota. The robberies were often brutal. People were pistol-whipped and terrified. Occasionally, they were killed. The money went to Jesse and Frank, to the younger brothers, to the men who rode with them. Not to the poor, not to the widow, not to the farmer. The Robin Hood story was a beautiful lie that someone else wrote. That someone else was John Newman Edwards. Edwards was a former Confederate officer turned newspaper editor in Kansas City. He had a gift for rhetoric and a personal investment in the mythology of the lost cause. He needed heroes for his defeated side. He found one in Jesse James. Every robbery, Edwards wrote, as an act of righteous defiance against northern banks and carpetbagger railroads. Jesse became a freedom fighter, a man pushed outside the law by Yankee injustice, a son of Missouri defending his people. Jesse read the papers. He understood exactly what was happening, and he used it. He began writing letters to Edwards. Careful, articulate letters that Edwards published verbatim, letters in which Jesse denied crimes he had committed and positioned himself as a wrongly persecuted man. He was performing the myth in real time, collaborating with its author. The public ate it whole, but the myth required constant maintenance. The gang had begun to fray by the mid-1870s. Too many robberies, too many witnesses. Pinkerton detectives had been hired, and the Pinkertons did not care about narrative. They tracked, they pressured. They threw a firebomb into the James family farmhouse in 1875, killing Jesse's 8-year-old half-brother and blowing off his mother's arm. The newspapers called it an atrocity. Public sympathy for Jesse surged. The Pinkertons had made the myth bulletproof. In September of 1876, the gang attempted to rob a bank in Northfield, Minnesota, and walked into a disaster. The town fought back. 2 gang members were killed in the street. 3 younger brothers were captured, shot to pieces. Frank and Jesse escaped into the swamps of the Midwest and disappeared. For 3 years, nobody knew where they were. They surfaced in Missouri under false names, living quietly, trying to pretend to be what they had never been. Ordinary men. Jesse had a wife named Zerelda, named after his mother, and 2 small children. He paced. He planned. He recruited. The new gang was worse than the old one. Younger men, less disciplined, men who talked too much and were afraid enough to talk to the wrong people. Jesse knew it. He just couldn't stop. He organized one more robbery, then another. The trails were getting shorter. The witnesses were getting closer. Missouri's governor offered $10,000 for Jesse James, dead or alive. $1,000 was a fortune. Inside the gang, a young man named Robert Ford calculated. April 3, 1882. Jesse was living in St. Joseph, Missouri under the name Thomas Howard. He was 34 years old. He had been running for 16 years. That morning, he walked into the sitting room of his rented house with Bob Ford and Bob's brother, Charlie. Jesse had been reading the morning paper. He turned to straighten a picture frame on the wall, a needlepoint that read, "God bless our home." He took off his gun belt. He always wore his guns, but he didn't want to get the holster dusty. Bob Ford drew and shot him in the back of the head. Jesse fell against the frame and slid to the floor. Zerelda ran in from the kitchen. She held his head. He was already gone. Bob Ford telegraphed the governor. He expected a hero's welcome. What he got was a murder charge, quickly pardoned, but a charge nonetheless. The pardon and the reward were paid. The welcome was not. Crowds hissed him in the street. A song was written immediately, Jesse James, the most popular American ballad of its decade. It called Bob Ford that dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard and laid poor Jesse in his grave. The newspapers that had been reporting his crimes for 15 years mourned him like a fallen knight. The poor people he had never actually helped wept at the railroad stations. John Newman Edwards wrote his obituary. It was the finest thing he ever wrote. It called Jesse James a Robin Hood of the border, a man who, if he was wronged, was a wronger of others, but in all his wild life he was never charged with one wrong against a woman or a child. It was mostly fiction, but it was beautiful fiction, and it had the advantage of arriving before the facts could. Frank James turned himself in 6 months later. He was tried twice and acquitted both times. He lived to be 72, running a farm, charging tourists a quarter to tour the property where Jesse was born. The Ford brothers did not fare as well. Charlie Ford shot himself 2 years later, unable to live with what he'd done. Bob Ford was shot dead in a tent saloon in Colorado 9 years after the killing by a man avenging Jesse's name. The man who killed Jesse James was killed by Jesse's legend. That is how powerful the myth had become. The real Jesse James robbed banks and trains for 16 years. He killed at least 4 men and was present at the deaths of dozens more. He stole from institutions, yes, but also from individual passengers, farmers, and travelers who could not afford the loss. He was not Robin Hood. He was a brilliant outlaw who understood publicity before publicity was a profession, who used a sympathetic journalist to construct an identity that could survive any atrocity, and who rode that identity until the man he trusted most put a bullet in the back of his skull. The myth survived him. It was the only thing he ever built that lasted.